Hi, I'm Seamless, and this took kind of a while, but I'm doing the next video in the making of Elimination. This track is interesting. It's one of the most unorganized horrors of the EP. It's pretty much the most. It's actually I think the most sort of clustery, if you catch my drift. Most of what happens that's weird is in the mixing, because I tried a couple of experiments in how I mixed and I mastered this track, and I only did it for this track, and that should tell you what I think about these experiments. Anywho, I'll go over what happened, what I did, and all this good stuff. Yeah, so primarily the weirdness of when I started making this track, I knew that I wanted to do one thing, like the point. I said, okay, cool, I'm doing a drum step track. And for me personally, drum step exists to also have drum and bass in it. And what I mean by that is that, okay, cool, it's halftime drum and bass. This means that, hey, we could do drum and bass. So the drop is very halftime, and then the second drop is very like that's I knew that I was gonna do that from the beginning. The thing is, though, is I had a particular assumption about how well the content in the first drop would translate into the second drop. I pretty much assumed that what I would do is I would make the first drop, and then I would double time it, and then I'd be fine. And then I'd make some variations or whatever to make it to fit the second whatever. But what actually ended up happening is that pretty much everything that I did for the first drop doesn't really work for the second drop. Like the main bass does, and a couple you know, like the granular basses do. But I had to make a whole new kit, like a drum kit for the second part. And this seriously created issues for how the mix was set up because of the way that I usually set up my track. Which is I make the drums, I do the side chaining, and that's all cool. And then everything is nice and ordered or whatever. But now I had to make a whole second set. Like I have kick 2, snare 2, hat 2, and I think I also have side 2 somewhere in here where it's side chaining basically a whole second. Yeah, there it is, side 2. It's a whole, basically a separate bus setup for the second half of this track, and that is just like, it worked out. Like I could still do it, but it was just very awkward. But we'll get to that. So let's talk about the drums in the first drop. That's them drums. So, like the other tracks, the way that I handle this out is that I have my kicks and whatever going on in places. And then where's the drum bus? Yeah, here's the drum bus. So, one of the things about compressing it, so the way that I do it is I set up the mixer so that I have the drums, and then the drums all go to its own basically submaster. It's kind of what you call a bus. It's like you're busting a group of things together to be in a bus, and then it goes out to the master. So it's kind of like a submaster. So like in the drums, it's a little bit more literal because I do master compression on just the drums, separate from everything else. And so in doing so, I use Maximus. Now, sort of fortuitous that it opened up on the high band, because one thing that's important to know about how compressors work in the relationship of the release settings, basically any time-based setting for compressor curves. So like attack and release in the head and all that good stuff. Like if we increase the speed really fast. So these are high frequency transients that we're looking at. So it's basically the overall level of what's in that area of the spectrum, which is up here. And even though I have the release set pretty low, if we speed up real fast, we can see that there actually is a pretty decent chunk being brought down off the transients. And the attack is on there as well, so some of the initial transient hit is still being preserved, that kind of deal. But this isn't really something you can do for the lows and the mids. Like the mids, you can see is huge, and the lows especially are even larger because they both have the same release time. But like the low end takes longer because it's a slower frequency. And the thing is, though, is if we were to use higher release settings on lower frequencies, we would notice. Because this would mean that the release itself would be faster than the oscillation of the frequencies. And if you did that, you get that kind of muddy compressory artifact that you don't like. Whenever you think like, oh, it's overcompressed, that's what people mean. That when we hear it being overcompressed, that's what's causing that. I am, of course, we have that sound here, but that's because it's intentional. Like I have, if you see on the master, I have a low release time, which means that it's a low release time on everything, including the low frequencies. So we're getting that exact feel that I mentioned. However, I am in control of it because I'm doing it on purpose. And of course, it's also being run through the actual master, which is compounding certain things. If we're going to separate the multi-band, basically the lesson that I want to get out of this is that if we're going to separate doing the whole multi-band business, that the higher the frequency of the band cut, the lower release time that you can safely have before it starts to become artifacty. Of course, what's going on in the master is totally irrelevant because I have this patch that's doing all manner of stupids, but we'll get to that. That'll be a thing that I get to. So what am I using as a kick sample here? All right, so I'm using bass drum as a kind of like a low end kind of thing. So those are just the two. Do I have Superior Drummer open, right? Yeah, I believe I'm only. I think these are only for the second half. Yeah, those are that's for the break in the second half. So I'm not using Superior Drummer at the beginning. I'm using just. Oh, so okay, that funness that we're hearing in the hats are actually because I'm doing the hats in Harmor. How cool is that? So I actually I made a hat sample. That reverb is post. That's what that sounds like. So, and actually this would have benefited from something that I learned later in Harmor. You know how when I had, okay, so I made it dry. And the hats kind of sound like shakers because it has a little bit of an attack on it, like a little more of an attack than you're used to. And you can actually solve this in Harmor by using the ramp setting. So by default in the advanced tab, we have time ramping, which is basically the attack for how things operate. So you can actually change this. So that's what that does. But I didn't know that when I made this track, so I didn't change it. Anyway, the point being is that I'm running in Harmor, and then I'm also modulating stuff when we are doing it in the track. This is a trick that I originally used in my track Tachycardia, which was one of the older projects that I put up the FLP for. So if you remember that track, this is where that came from. In fact, I believe I started working on this track soon after I made that track. The two primary things that I'm modulating are the time, the speed setting, and then also the prism. And so here we had the envelopes here. I'm also like doing different like velocities and whatever, just because. The speed amount is a positive and negative thing, which means the top half is a positive 0 to 200%. So 75% is actually straight regular time, and then 100% is actually twice as fast. 50% is not moving at all, and then 25% is negative 100, and then all the way down is really fast in reverse. So that we get those reverse stuff when I go all the way back down like that, and then the prism just changes. It's a weird effect. That's cool. This is deep. So that's the hats for this, for the first drop anyway. And then everything else is just regular, like I think a ride sample. What am I using for a snare? Just this guy. So okay, this is from the Crispy Dinner Pack. I don't know. I don't even know where you get that because someone else gave it to me. I sure hope it's not for sale. Otherwise, I would have pirated it. Oh, whatever. I ruined it enough that it's not really just what it is originally. Anyway, so that's what pretty much is going on for the drums, is being compressed. And like, I didn't really cover, what I specifically did for the compression. And this is kind of why I don't really do lots of mastering tutorials, is because like the answer to how do you master stuff is you put a multi-band compressor on it and then you compress it. That's the end of the story. One thing I did differently for this than I actually do this a lot now, but what I didn't really do immediately after I did this track is that I don't do soft saturation on the drum master. I let the peaks go above 0 dB when they do. I compress it a little bit, but not so much, and it's because it's gonna get saturated in the master. So like, there's not really a reason to send saturated stuff to be saturated again. Like, so and actually, I guess it wouldn't be saturated, would it? Because long as it's kind of saturated. Point being, it's going above 0 dB because it's gonna eventually be brought down in the actual master. Because remember, this is a submaster. Quite. And so the kick and the snare are both side chaining everything. So in this track, I'm not compressing all the synths together, which is what I do in the side chain. That's what side chaining sounds like without the drums involved. And the reason why I could do that is because I turned off the drum bus. However, the actual individual drums, which is where the source of the side chaining is coming from, are still being routed, and they're still freely going into the side chaining. Because when they're routed, they're being routed. When you side chain something, when you route something for side chaining, if you're not doing the automation route or the controller route with the peak controller, you route them into the channel and then you turn the volume all the way off. So this means that we're not hearing any audible information. However, the actual peak information is still being transmitted, which is what the side inputs on plugins that support that get it from. So that's why that works. As in terms of like EQing and stuff on individual things, it's all very case by case, and I'll cover that in the sound design portion of the making of, where I individually go over each sound, like synth and stuff like that. The reason why I talk about the drums is because mixing this kind of music is all about your drums. Like the bass is pretty contentious. Like you want your consistent bass and whatever. That's part of mixing, but I deal with that at the sound design level. That's how I do that. And then I compress stuff, obviously, but the drums, more importantly, the kicks and the snares, are the loudest elements in your track. You might be thinking, oh, the basses sound pretty loud, whatever. It's not. The drums and the snare, kick and the snare, loudest elements, which means that in terms of how you deal with your mix and your master, those are the two things that everything revolves around for this kind of music, if you're me. So that's why I talk about the drums in this segment. So now let's talk about the mastering, where this monstrosity exists. So this was an experiment. So Maximus has the 3 bands, and they exist. I actually thought of a way better way to do this, and now I'm going to do this for a new experiment. But anyway, they exist to alleviate the problems of when you compress everything together in one band. Like a pretty obvious example. I actually have a tutorial that discusses this in my compression series. It's just 2 videos, one on the limiter and one on Maximus. But a simple thing is like, you have a mix like this. I say the kick and the snare are the loudest things. And the kick has a huge amount of low end, and then it comes up, and the low frequencies tend to be a lot louder than high frequencies. So when you have something that goes above 0 dB or above whatever your threshold is, if it's not 0 dB, then it'll compress it, but it brings down everything, including the other frequencies, when it brings down to low frequencies. Multi-band compression takes care of peaking and stuff like that compartmentally through selection of bands. So there's a huge peak or spike in the low end, then it'll only be compressed to the low end because it's only compressing that, and the mids and the highs are not touched. That's the point of multi-band compression. So I decided, well, if 3 bands are good, why not do 10 bands? I think 10 bands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yes. Why not do 10 bands? So the way that I did this is I used Patcher. And in Patcher, I used a Fruity Convolver to do linear phase equalization. Because in the Convolver, there's a preset for linear phase equalization, where you have this extremely short sample, and then you can just EQ it. And because the sample is so unbelievably short, like the impulse is just a click. Which means that this basically means, in terms of convolution reverb, that what the sound that goes in is the sound that comes out pretty much 1-to-1. That's why the dry is all the way off and the wet's all the way on, because it's pretty much the same sound. And by pretty much, I mean identically. So then the equalizer we just carve it up. And it's because it's linear phase EQ, there's a bit of latency involved. That's why when I hit play, there's like a full half-second delay. But that's okay because it's on the master, which means everything is going to be delayed together. Nothing's going to get out of sync as a result. So I have each convolver is a tiny segment of the frequencies. This is the first time I tried doing this, and if I do it again, I probably would do some things differently. So I did 10 bands. I did 10 even spreads, like even cut here of particular sections, and it's a little bit hard to visualize this. I mean, I could just show you an EQ. Like look at how the spectrums are broken up down here. We have 20 to 50. That's a space of 30 hertz. That's how big this cut is. And if we go over here, we have 5K to 10K. This is a space of 5,000 hertz. And it's a smaller space than the other space, but it's a lot more of frequencies, right? So it's weighted in a particular way that the low end is spread apart more visually than the high end. This is pretty. I mean, this is common weighting for how the spectrum is usually, put out. But notice that the cuts are more or less relatively even. Like there's some cuts that are a little bit like spacey in different ways, but in doing even cuts like this, they actually are weighted differently. So over here, this is 20 to 100, and then over here is 100 to 200, and over here is 200 to 500, that kind of thing. So the cuts are even, but they're weighted the weight, because the weighting is different. This means actually each space encompasses more individual frequencies. What I should have done is I should have tailored these cuts to the actual frequency content of the song. What I mean by that is kind of like how I do Maximus. Now, Maximus actually gives you the option to have linear phase filters, which, what do I mean by filter? What is filtering in Maximus? The filters are the band cuts, because when you're not using linear phase, you're using what's called minimum phase. And there's this whole difference between what linear phase and minimum phase EQ means. But basically what this means is that if you're not using linear phase, then your cuts are not the straight line that you think they are. They're actually more like this. If I make a high pass and then do steep, like they're basically this. You see how it's kind of a little uneven? Like it's not 100% straight. It's angled. You get this, and then you get actually, if you look at the other multiband compressor in Fruity Loops FL Studio, which I don't have open because I don't have it engaged. Because I don't need it engaged. Okay, this is the free multiband EQ. This came out in FL8, I think. It was pretty bitchin' when it did. But if you look at the cuts, they look like this. They start to go down, and they kind of crossfade with the other cuts. And you can overlap or whatever. But this is what EQ bands look like when you mess around with the bands. And this is also what Maximus cuts look like if we were to look at the actual setup like that. However, I mean, you could choose between either 12 dB or 24 dB cuts, which basically just tells you how sharp the cuts are. But they're still not perfectly sharp, which is why when I made these cuts, when I actually put them where they are, which are not the default positions, but when I did, I looked at the spectrum, and I noted that the snare transient fundamental frequency is right around here, around 200 hertz, which is usually where it is anyway for most people's snares, and unless you're Cohen sound and your snares up at like 500 hertz, but you have that there. And then I put the cut kind of far away from that because I wanted to ensure that none of the snare transient ends up in the bass. A little bit of it still does because there's still a little bit of bass in the snare, and you kind of want that because that's how you get the thump. But that's why it's pretty far away, because if I made the cut right up where the transient was, a whole bunch of it would actually still be in the low end. And that's how I separated. I separated being low end, mid, and high end based more or less around the drum. So the low end is kick drum and bass. The mids are snare and everything that's mids. And then the highs are everything else, like hats and stuff. The thing is, though, is that just even though this is three bands, this is not as like, especially for things like snares. Snares are very frequency rich and diverse things, as denoted by how I EQ the snare. So as you see here, I do this. It is pretty commonly. I peak the hell out of the fundamental tone so that we hear the. That's pretty much what causes that. And then over in these mids, I kind of brought it down, but I also brought up the highs. Snares are pretty full frequency things. They're not bass instruments, but they're pretty full frequency. And in fact, these days we kind of treat them like very high-pitched kick drums. That's kind of how we deal with them. Like AU5's drum creation and production style is to do the whole pitch modulation thing, so that instead of going do, it goes do, that kind of thing, which a kick drum does. It goes pew really fast, which creates the thump, which creates the kick, and that's how we hear things like that. Like if I were to look at the frequency spectrum of the kick drum, we see it go wah, 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 really fast. That's what creates the percussive sound of it, because it feels a whole lot of frequencies really fast. And same deal with the snare. So like I'm not doing it in this track in particular, but that's one way of doing it. But there's also highs and like slightly low. Like there's like sections of a snare that we hear, that we identify. There's the really high frequency part, that the snizzle and like that's the pop of it. And then there's like a slightly less high, like around 2K, 5K. That sounds very clappy. That's we associate like a very like just to see house sounding snare. That's in every snare. It's just how hard you push that. And then there's like sort of lower mids, and then there's the fundamental tone. These are all separate and problematic sections of a snare, because other things in a track, like your very mid-heavy bass samples, a vocal sample, like hi-hats and stuff, lead elements, they all interact and have different problems with snares. So like if I'm sidechaining everything to the snare, but if I sidechain it like everything evenly, like a vocal, a lead line, a bass, if I treated all of them the same with a snare's loudest part, which is the fundamental tone, then they're all going we all, even though we're in just the mid section of the compressor, we still have the same original problem that we did with the single band compressor, where only a very small section of it is peaking and it's bringing down everything else. So you can kind of solve this by doing very selective sidechaining. Like you can do the controller thing that we mentioned with the peak controller, where you put the peak controller on here and whatever, and then you control like this EQ on other things, so that when the sidechain hits, instead of bringing down everything, it brings down only the part that you want it to. And so you can do that. It's difficult, but you can, and that's all well and good. However, why not be procedural about it? And by procedural, I mean let's create a multi-band compressor that deals with each individual problems, which I did not do. That's what my ultimate point that I'm trying to make is that what I should have done is I should have identified the problem sections of each of the of the track and be like, okay, cool. Like we don't need a multi-band compressor, right? Like the highest highs could be its own thing. And then from here to here is where the snare, this very particular snare exists and has very particular problems with only this track exists between these specific points. And then over here, like a huge swath from like 2K to 200 is meaningless, in the context of the snare. And then 200, like 100 to 500 hertz could be, okay, here's where the snare transient exists, and the loudest part is here's where it needs to be, like only right here needs to be compressed. And then, the low end, that kind of deal is also meaningless as far as the snare goes. And like if you think about it, that's actually kind of what sidechaining does. Sidechaining is and also volume automation are all forms of compression, in the sense that we're doing dynamic range corrections just procedurally for the frequency. So if we split it up like that, and like I set up a split for 100 to 500. Whenever a giant snare peak comes in, it's gonna, and like there's other stuff happening. Like here's a snare peak, and here's like, the bass frequency peaks happening as well. Whenever this huge peak comes in, the compressor's gonna bring it down, but it's also gonna bring down the other guys, so that okay, actually a good example of what, like this is what's gonna happen here, and so then it's gonna bring everything down, but only for that one section, and so now this is what's gonna end up happening. And like these sort of things will happen where like it'll bring down unintended frequencies, but that's the point of like ever sharpening your specific multi-band compressor designs by what bands you have. And then but this is still what the sidechaining would accomplish too if you did the individual frequency sidechaining. So if you want to attempt the weirdness that I did with this, that's what I would recommend you do. Is you shape it to the very specific problems that exist in your specific track, which again is also why I don't really do tutorials on this regard. And I only ever talk about this in the context of a finished track. so I can explain like the reasons and the hows of why I do something, or what I should have done in the case of this guy. So let's talk about the actual patcher here. So I have my linear phase EQ splits, and then I run them all into single band limiters. And the limiter works, you know, like a regular compressor. I didn't try very hard. And like I said before, when I was looking at the Maximus, I thought of an easier way to do it, or at least a better way. Not necessarily should be easy. The limiters are not, they don't do compression as good as Maximus does. Maximus is a wave shaper compressor, where it compresses via manipulating the in-out graph directly, like the wave shaper does for distortion, only because it has time variables, it doesn't distort. It just compresses smoothly. The limiter works old school compression-wise, where you have threshold and ratios and all that good stuff, and I did not tailor the individual limiters, for the sections that they did. I just limited everything, and I kind of rolled off on the higher ones, but like it's still very, why did I do that? Like it was very experimental, and I don't really like, again, I learned from it, but this particular sort of extravagant method was less than effective. Like I could have gotten a much better mix just by doing what I normally do. So what I did do, like this this is the ultimate compress 6 times, bro, like joke. Cause like think about like the kicks and the snares, for example. So the kick samples that I ended up using were already compressed a lot just by creating the samples themselves, especially the this guy, the groove maker samples that are in the FL stock are definitely compressed samples. They were processed very heavily. So like at best, let's say they're compressed once. They're probably compressed more than that, but let's say they're compressed once. And then they go into the drum master where it's being compressed again. And then it goes into the master where it's being compressed before it goes into the patcher, it's being compressed. And then it gets compressed again in the patcher. And then it gets compressed again in another Maximus. Each Maximus is actually compressing twice, by the way, parallel with the multiband and then again on the master. So we're talking about compressed at the start, compressed twice in the bus, compressed twice before the Maximus, so that's 5 times, and then compressed in the patcher once and then twice out, so that's 8 times total. Compress 8 times, bro. Ugh. So that's why this track got out of hand. It got really out of hand, but it's an important step in learning some things. I made this track like a year ago, more than that. It's pretty old, so I've learned some stuff since then. But it's pretty interesting to kind of go over. What ended up not working out so well, but still a good idea. Like tailoring your frequency splits, you know, for stuff is still a good solid plan. I just didn't do it very well, or at all. And then for the second half, we have new drums. Now, here's the thing about this. I wanted to get a very drum and bass feel, and I have this loop that I used. I basically wanted just the kind of the ride out of this, so that's why it's high pass. That's not like normally when I drop out into a track or whatever and I play a sample, it's because it has some effect it hasn't engaged yet. Nope, this is what the sound sounds like. Now, this is mixed very differently for two reasons. One, because when I double timed the original drop, it didn't work. Like it didn't flow and it felt bad and it was mixed odd. And like it was mixed odd because drum step, you can think of it as halftime drum and bass, or you can think of it as slightly faster dubstep. That's probably why it's called drum step and not just drum and bass. And when that has different connotations, not just for the whole halftime concept and for like the idea of the groove and the flow, but a particular palette of sounds and like an image that we create when we think about what dubstep is. And that kind of stuff doesn't translate very well to real drum and bass. Well, what do I call real drum and bass? I mean that in terms of the old school, like Andy C, Rody size, like Noisia kind of drum and bass stuff. That's like not very, the kick and the snare are not so hugely hardcore defined and like stupidly hard as like liquid drum and bass can be. And you can do that because there's not a lot of bass action. That's why a liquid drum and bass can be mixed like that. And so I wanted that though when I was making this track, but I got into the dubstep frame of mind for the first drop. So then the second drop, I'm thinking, okay, nothing that I have in the drums can be used. I have to do all new drums. And I still kind of I still mixed it like, you know, sharp and hard with the thumpiness and whatever. That's because we have that in our that's our mindset now. We went through the first drop. We went through the big old melodic drop. So like we have that feeling of this track in our mind. We can't not do that now. So in the second part, it's like it's got to be a weird mesh between those worlds of the sort of like the groovy feeling of drum and bass and the hard feeling of like the dubstep kind of stuff, the brutality of it. And this I don't really think I succeeded very well. I succeeded as best as I could in the situation, and also the situation I created with the stupid mastering. Like that, this is very much damage control. And so this is what, but actually, like, because that's what I wanted, I basically allowed myself to have what would be characterized as mastering problems and mixing problems in what would be a dubstep track, a dubstep mixed EDM style track versus a drum and bass feel. Because if you go back and listen to those drum and bass feels, like those tracks that you like old Nausea, old like a Belaine track or something, if you go listen to it, the kicks and the snares are not nearly as hardcore defined as a drum as like a real dubstep banger is, which is what the track ended up being. And it still feels good when you listen to it all. It's like a wave of sound. Like that's basically what I ended up getting at. So I allowed myself what would in the dubstep world be, you know, kick and snare mixing mistakes for the sake of the feel of what I wanted to get out of it. And I feel like I succeeded, but I don't think it was a wonderful idea. This track as a whole wasn't a wonderful idea. I honestly think it's my weakest track on the EP. However, like I still, as a technical experience, as an engineering quest, I feel like I learned a lot. So that was very important. And also some of the sound design is pretty cool, which I think is like, it's kind of my definition of my producing is that, yeah, my sound design is pretty cool, but pretty much every other aspect of the track needs work. That's kind of how I roll. So the mixer, the kick and everything, kind of the kick is there, and the whole the superior drummer when I brought in to make it feel more like a break, the old break that I used to make it feel more like a break, like I brought that over to the second half of the mixer, routed it into side 2, and side 2 is actually routed back into the I thought I routed side 2 back into the actual original side chaining, which would have made sense, but I did not. Oh, it's the opposite. I routed the first side chain into side chain 2. That's what I did. So the original side chain, it doesn't go into master. It goes into side chain 2. This is because when I made the drop, all the drop elements like they're still based on things that are routed in the original routing. They're still being sidechained by the original drums. They're still being sidechained by all this stuff, and I can't like unroute it and reroute it. So I just put the original sidechain, which only has sidechaining in it, because I did not compress the track together through the sidechaining. Actually, did I compress it through the second sidechain? No, I didn't. So like, and this means that there's only limiters happening, and if I'm not using the original samples, then those limiters that are happening in the original sidechain channel have no effect on the sound. So it's as if it's got its own routing going on in the sidechain 2, because I am using other elements of the original mix in there, and especially the second half of the second drop, which has all the melodic elements. So that works. Occupied. So anyway, this track was a bit of a cluster, like I said, and it still worked out. Could have been better. However, I hope that this gives you ideas for potential sort of engineering direction that you could take for, you know, like the super multi-band compression kind of thing. Like 3 bands is nice, and like the idea that let's do 10 bands, let's do 100 bands, like that's not a thing that needs to happen. At least not in the way that I did it. Like maybe I could come up with a better idea, like the new idea that I had that I'm not going to explain because it might be stupid. And if I guess when I figure that out, I'll let you know. Anywho, if you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.